and welcome to yet another OC Forum program. Thank you so much for joining us and being a part of the conversation. Today we are doing our final segment of our special series on social media, and today's topic is going to be social media and mental health. A really big topic, a concern for many people, and I am so fortunate to have with us today Dr. Husty from Chalk Children's right here in Orange County. And Dr. Husty, welcome to the program, to the OC Forum. I know you've been a guest in the past, but thank you with being here with us. And could you share a little bit about your role at Chalk and some of your areas of expertise? Because I think our audience really needs to know that background.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ariana. I really appreciate the opportunity today. So I'm the chief psychologist at Chalk. So as a part of that role, I oversee our psychology department, which also includes a wide variety of staff. It's our psychologists, as well as we have amazing social workers and marriage and family therapists, as well as personal service coordinators that work in sort of almost peer positions with patients. We have our amazing administrative team, and we also have a training program that we run for both psychology students, and we're adding some social work students as well. So we're super excited about that. And then we oversee the programming for a wide range of mental health programs at Chalk. So as you know, we have all the way from an inpatient psychiatric center through the emergency department, where we evaluate children. We work with children who are hospitalized for medical conditions. We have outpatient services. We have a full service partnership, which was kind of a wraparound program. We work with kids with eating disorders. So we have the sort of whole gamut that we work with. I've been a licensed psychologist for, over 30 years. Oh my gosh, hard to believe. And in that time, mostly working with children and adolescents and their families, particularly children with medical concerns, which is kind of a specialty area. And then recently broadened into more sort of the acute area as well. So I've been seeing kids a long time and have watched sort of changes, including the sort of watching social media sort of come up and explode, all the way from I'll age myself, the MySpace starting, all the way into now, TikTok, and trying to keep up on all the different things going on.
Gosh, I haven't heard MySpace in a long time, but yeah,
I
it's just
know,
like, wow,
right?
that goes back, dates us both, actually. So,
it does.
and I want to just go back for a minute, especially with Chalk, because I don't think everybody knows that, aside from being a leader, just in this area, of mental health, Chalk has recently opened, is it right to say, a pediatric inpatient facility within the Chalk, the main facility?
Yeah.
And that's really,
Yeah.
I mean, that wasn't just done because you just wanted to do it. There's really a need for that, and you guys are really at the forefront of addressing that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a tremendous need. So we opened a little over 3 years ago our Charisse Marie Lallier mental health inpatient center, and we really saw the need that there were no inpatient psychiatric beds for kids under the age of 12 in Orange County. And that's really what motivated us. And it was a multi-year planning process. We were able to open the unit because of the support of the community. So it was almost all with donor funds, which we just are so blessed with our community support. And we've been pretty well full. We have 18 beds. And we do some things that are unique in California. All of our beds are private, so all the rooms are private. And we do that because we feel like it's really important for parents to be able to visit anytime when their child's in an inpatient mental health center. In most inpatient mental health centers, parents can only visit for about an hour and a half a day. And we thought, particularly when we're seeing the little ones, it'd be nice if parents felt like they could stay all the time,
Right.
And that we can work together to sort of come up with a treatment plan. We also do a lot of events and try and really normalize and destigmatize the idea of being hospitalized for a mental health issue because it's like any other health issue, right? Health is health. We want kids to be treated just the same, whether they're being hospitalized for a physical health issue or for a mental health issue. So we do a lot of things um, to normalize that, including having, celebrations for Hanukkah and Christmas, having Halloween celebrations, a Thanksgiving celebration where we invite the families. We're so proud of our unit. It's run by Dr. Wayne Wynn, who's our head of psychiatry, and Danny Milliken, who's our nursing director. They're amazing, and it's a great unit.
So let's talk about what you're seeing in this unit. And you mentioned that it's been full almost since it opened, which is,
Yeah.
I guess, alarming in some ways, but also shows that there's a real need to be addressing this. The last year and a half, 2 years, I can't even believe I'm saying it's almost been 2 years now. There have been a lot of things going on. Obviously, you have the pandemic, you have kids out of school, you have parents home, you have, people in unusual circumstances. But what's been going on even longer is the influence of social media on kids. Where are you seeing, in terms of social media, where are you seeing that affecting kids' mental health? Both and I don't want to, just blanket it, just that it's all bad, but where are you seeing kind of the nexus of good and bad?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate your balance in that, because I think it's easy, right, to just paint with a broad brush. I think, one of the things and one of the reasons, for good reason, people have some thoughts about social media use in kids is we have seen this precipitous rise in depression and anxiety amongst teenagers over the last 10 years or so, which worries all of us. And it does mimic the rise in smartphones and access to social media. So I think that's where a lot of the concerns started, right? As we start to look at those two curves going together, you start to wonder, does one sort of fuel the other? And
Right.
we do know
Is there a
yeah,
causation or is there just a correlation?
right. And that's the thing, right? It's hard to tease that apart. And I think when you start to go a little more in depth, to your point, there's good and bad, right? It's a tool like any other tool. If I take a hammer and hammer on my hands, it doesn't mean the hammer's bad. It just
Right.
means I shouldn't be hammering on my hands, right?
Right.
And so social media may be similar to that, right? If there are, when you think about kids maybe who struggle and feel alone, social media often can connect children in a way of going, wow, I'm not the only one who feels this way, or I'm not the only one who's like this. And it can actually be empowering, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when social media leads to you comparing yourself in a negative way, or saying, "Oh my gosh, look at how everyone looks on social media. I don't meet that standard, so there's something wrong with me," then it can cause and lead problems. In addition, because social media is open 24 hours a day, I'm going to date
Right.
myself again for just a minute. It used to be after you left school, you'd have to pick up the phone and talk, make an effort to talk to someone, and you didn't have, everyone weighing in, right? You could escape if you were being bullied, or escape the opinions of others, and you didn't know necessarily that everyone was going to a
Right.
party. And on social media, all of that is laid out, right? It's 24/7. You can be bullied by people who don't
Right.
even know you. It's easy to look at posts and be like, oh my gosh, everyone else out there is having so much more fun than me. And to start to feel bad, right? So one of the things that they found with social media is children who use it and engage with it. So I'm thinking about what I'm commenting on. I'm not just scrolling through sort of mindlessly. Tend not to have the depression and the anxiety associated with social media use. Whereas those who are a little bit more passive consumers tend to be at higher risk,
Oh,
right, for
really?
that depression and anxiety. So I think one of the lessons for that is, one, it's a tool like any tool, that a blanket sort of, let's not let people have, or kids have access to social media is probably too black and white thinking about it, right?
More too much too extreme the other way.
Exactly. But if we look at it like a tool and teach our children to use a tool wisely, then perhaps there's positives to it, right? And some of those things are, you see some influencers now posting things like, look, here's what my body really looks like, but when I do this certain pose,
Right.
I look, I get that look that's really physically impossible, but it's just about the posing or the lighting.
Right.
And that I took 1,000 pictures to get that
one.
one little Instagram.
And
right?
for me personally, where
so-
I see a celebrity saying, this is what I look like without makeup, this is the non-Photoshop, non-hair, I'm like, oh, hallelujah, thank you for showing what it really looks like. Because, and I mean, for you and I both, we're both of an age before social media. I mean, I remember there were mean girls before social media. There are mean girls now. And yes, it amplifies, but it's not that it's anything new, right? I mean, those things are just, they're just getting more time and saturation than maybe what you and I had as a young person.
They are. And I think because on social media, you can consume that alone sometimes, whereas, when we were dealing with the mean girls in school, there often were people around, right? And so that did the things that you might not say, knowing that there's a teacher coming down the hall or other students around. When it's all anonymous, it's so much easier to escalate that discord, right? And I do think our almost 2 years, oh my gosh, of physical separation from each other has really fueled a less civil discourse, right? Because we are not as able to, sort of look at each other in the face and say those things, right? We can say it on social media, and it just, becomes this, who can make the most clever statement, and whether I'm hurting someone or not, I'm just not even processing that because I'm not getting that feedback, right?
Well, and you bring up a great point, because I hadn't even thought about that isolation. You're right. If something had happened in school when I was in junior high, I had my girls around me. I had, my guy friends. I had people who could stand up for me or temper that conversation and just, put their arm around you and look you in the eye and say, it's okay. They're just being ridiculous. Let's move on, ignore them. If you're alone, especially in the pandemic, you're not going to have that, that immediate kind of bucking up, when something brings you down, and then it's compounded.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there is, when you are getting sort of piled on, there can be a sense of shame that goes with that. So you don't want to tell, right? And so that just leads to more isolation and more sort of rumination, right? And I think the other thing that happens as children mature into teenagers, naturally it's evolutionary, right? You start to move away from your family of origin, right? And sort of develop that, who am I as a person, which means I'm not going to
tribe.
Exactly. So I'm not going to go to my parents, but if I'm not with my tribe in school, it's hard to know, like, where's my tribe? Where's my sort of place? And I'm sort of isolated from talking with my parents. So I think one of the things I would say to the parents out there is, it's okay to ask. And, however, one has to be careful of not interrogation of, what are you doing? What's going on? You got to do.
It has to be a conversation.
It has to be a conversation. I got to say, if I could do all of my therapy driving people in a car, I would be like the best adolescent therapist ever, because there's something about just that riding in a car. You're not looking at each other. There's not that pressure.
But you're still
there's
physically
an opportunity to have those conversations.
You're still physically the proximity and
Yeah, exactly. So that might be one thing, like take a car ride with your adolescent, listen to the music they want to listen to, and then maybe have a conversation like, what do you think about those lyrics? Which band do you like? I think also I often say to parents, start the conversation with, what do your friends think about? because that's sometimes an easier entree of, I'm not asking you what you're
Right.
thinking, but I'm just asking you, what do other people think? And then you can kind of go in, oh, do you agree with that? Or what do you think? And be open to that
Right.
conversation. And I think, um, I'm very blessed to, uh, you know, work with adolescents, hear about adolescents and kids, and there's a lot of wisdom there when we really listen to them, and a lot of um, things that they're trying to figure out. And so those conversations can be so rich and meaningful when we're both open to that, right? So how do I set that stage? The other thing you can do, especially to broach topics that are a little more sensitive, is in watching a movie or a TV show together, to just comment on, what do you think's going on there? Oh my gosh, that was quite the reaction. What do you think about that? And just start the conversation rolling there on something that's important. And I do often have parents say to me, like, "Wow, like try and get my teen to like watch a movie with me or play a game with me." And what I'll say back to parents is, just go and do it anyway, and just show how much
Right.
fun you're happening. And pretty soon you're going to see your kid kind of be like, can I be a part of that? And don't make a big deal about it,
Right.
but just let them sort of slip on in there. So, and I,
Well, I
yeah,
my two sons who are past their teenage years will tell anyone who will listen how many times that I got them in a car and that's when we had our talks. So I love
yeah,
that advice. But the things that you mentioned, these aren't necessarily new tools.
no,
They may just be just kind of reminding people about good parenting techniques. Are
yeah.
there new tools that people should consider too, or just kind of tried and true reminders that you can give parents?
Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of the tools are really tried and true reminders that I think, when, uh, gosh, life is so hard right now. So I'm going to tell you my biggest tried and true tool right at the moment, but I think it's important for us all to remember is, you know, this pandemic is not easy, and we've all, someone the other day I heard likened it to, we've all been through a war, and no disrespect to our veterans, because I know a war is horrible, and it's much worse than this. And that sense of it's sort of a national trauma to some extent, I think is important to remember, and to give yourself some grace that I'm doing the best I can in these moments. I don't have to be perfect. If my kid isn't doing all their homework perfectly, you know, they're probably tired and overwhelmed as well, and that's okay. So to add that caring for ourselves as parents, so that we can sort of emotionally refill our cups, as well as filling that cup for our kids, and having that sort of moment of grace of, let's just do the best we can, and to recognize the people around us are doing the best they can too. No
Right.
one's sort of setting out to go, let me just make your life miserable. It really is, I'm just having the same struggles you are too. And so how do I open myself up to that and kind of be like, okay, how do we have that conversation then, right? And how do we care for each other?
One of the things that just I've often wondered about, and I know that we hadn't thought about talking about this, but when we talk about social media, particularly with young people, you mentioned that they're maturing. They're not fully mature at this point, and their
Right.
brains work differently right now because of hormones and everything else that we've always associated with that maturing process. How
Yeah.
much does that just change in chemistry when you're a young person, your mind's still developing, and how much does addiction play into it, or just what causes the causes of addiction get exacerbated by this, or does it at all?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think we continue as a field to struggle a little bit with, does are video games addictive? Is social media addictive? I will say we do know that, um, there are sort of, areas of the brain that sort of get lit up when you're playing a video game or scrolling through social media, that are similar to those pleasure centers, right? That kind of keep you
Hmm.
coming back. And I do think it's one of those things to be aware of, am I having balance in my
Right.
life? I mean, not to say don't do social media because it's addictive, but do I have balance in my life that I'm connecting with other people, like not just on social media? Am I going outside? Am I exercising? Is there that balance? If there's that
Right.
balance, I'm probably doing okay. And maybe I don't need to be too worried. But if my life is revolving around one thing, be it social media, video games, food,
Right.
anything, right? Drugs, alcohol, then I really need to watch to try and pull my life back into balance, right? That balance is what's important. So we know that, there's things about social media, those quick sorts of things of I get those quick hits of stimulation that encourage the brain to continue to, sort of look at stories.
Right.
And we know that, I mean, I know for myself, I'll take those moments where I'm like, I've got to be on a social media break for a little while because I see myself either getting so
Right.
upset, so anxious,
Right.
so whatever that I got to be like, all right, take a step back, balance out. In terms of brain development, so great question of are young brains more um, uh, vulnerable to addiction? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'd have to dig into the literature a little bit more. I think it's a great question. But I will say one thing we do know about young brains, and honestly, we now learn that our brains don't really get to that adult state until we're in our
Wow.
early 20s. So, 23, 24-ish. I think we used to say 16, 18. We know it's actually further back than that. But one of the big things is what we call our frontal lobe, our executive functioning, that ability to both plan and understand long-term consequences does not really form fully until you're about 23, 24. So I think one of the problems with social media is as adults, we're a little better able to, that's one person's opinion, but I know in the greater
Right.
scheme of things, what does that matter? For a teenager whose brain isn't there yet, there is that sort of belief of like, oh my God, this really is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and I will never feel better. Um,
Well, and for all those people who say I was so much more mature at 14, at 15, probably not. That's probably a misnomer as well. You probably
yeah,
weren't that mature. I wasn't that mature until I hit my 20s and had seen a thing or two.
yeah, exactly. I love this one quote, and I wish I could remember who said it, but it might have been like Irma Bombeck or someone, but it was like I was so surprised to find out how much my parents learned between when I was 14 and when I was 21. That there is that, right?
Exactly. I mean, it is
Yeah,
different because, like, I think back to my parents who were married and had children by the time they were 21. I moved
yeah,
that back. I know that the next generation is like holding off even more so of that. So, but it's not necessarily
yeah,
maturity that was driving that, So I just,
yeah.
and it harkens back to what you said. We need to give each other a little grace on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because I think we're all just trying to do the best we can, right?
And so let me ask you a final question, which is, we all know that there's challenges, and I think you probably better than anyone else, but the challenges in monitoring a child's social media use. What tips can you give on that? You mentioned balance. Is there anything else that people should be looking for, maybe using as tactics?
Yeah. I know a lot of parents set as a condition of social media use that I need your passwords, I need to be able, or I need to be friended. I think teenagers are very good at, figuring out other accounts or other ways. So I think you should know in the back of your heads, that may be helpful. And there may be other things I'm not aware of. So I think the other thing, is, looking for balance in your child's life, monitoring, am I seeing behavioral changes? So is sleep different? Is eating different? Are they not engaging with the family? That's often a warning sign that something's going on and bears maybe a little deeper digging, a little deeper dive. And I think also, continuing to work with teens to understand um, the whys, like, right, to be a better consumer of social media and like of advertisements and media in
Right.
general. Of, well, why are they saying that? Do they have a vested interest in that? Why are bullies bullies? Bullies are bullies because they're hurt themselves. It's not because they're
Hmm.
so perfect. So how do we understand people's behavior? How do we understand, hey, that's a picture of one out of 1,000 pictures? Or people who are media influencers, that's their job. So they need to post things
Right.
that people go about, right? Or start
Yeah.
conversation.
Being provocative is part of what they do.
Yeah. And so that's fine. There's no problem
Yeah.
with that. But I think it's important to understand that, right? And that parents can help educate their children about that. And teens do not like to be made fools of. So when they're like, hey, they think you're stupid that you don't get this, teens are like, that's right. So it's an easy way to kind of engage them, right, in learning about that.
They can be passionate on all sides and all at
Ex-
the same time. So
exactly. Exactly.
well, Dr. Husty, as always, a pleasure to have you on the OC Forum. You've given us some really valuable information, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And for those of you watching, please stick with us. We'll be right back with our next guest.
The OC Forum is Orange County's premier nonpartisan current affairs organization. Top business and civic leaders meet in an interactive environment to foster relationships, exchange ideas, and discuss public policy. The OC Forum is the catalyst to inspire collaboration to discuss today's complex issues. Keeping you informed since 1990. Great speakers, great audiences, great opportunities. Join the conversation. Visit ocforum.org.
Welcome back to the OC Forum and our special presentation on social media. This is the third and final installment of our special series, and today we are focusing on mental health, particularly mental health in children as it pertains to social media. So I am very grateful to welcome Dr. Megan Chiarelli from the Providence SoCal Mental Health Institute, which is a mouthful to say, but Dr. Chiarelli, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just start off with, I would love for you to be able to tell our audience a little bit more about what you do at Providence and your role there with I did not know they had a full mental health institute, so I'm grateful to know that, but I'd like to know more.
Yeah, so I am a fellowship trained board certified general psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatrist. So my work with Providence Mental Health Institute is to help our foundations and ministries provide the best evidence-based care so that we can meet the needs of all the patients that we serve. I also have a clinical practice where I see patients as well under the Providence umbrella.
And, with what we're talking about today with social media and particularly with kids, we were coming out of an incredible year where kids have been isolated, and this has been both a tool and a lifeline, but also in isolation, kind of the only thing that they've been exposed to on a regular basis. No school, no face-to-face friends. Are there any trends or anything that you're seeing as it pertains to that from just the last year?
I think probably everybody could identify there's been some big lifestyle shifts, both for children as well as adults. The pandemic has really forced us to tap into alternative means of communication, of work, of schooling, and that has meant there's been a lot less in-person time, necessarily so. But we are seeing an increase in screen time in general, and that this social media and other outlets are really the only mechanism by which we could try to maintain some, fullness in life in some ways. So I would say that in general, the trends have moved away from our previous guidance about limiting screen time and seeing this more as an important tool and necessity, and moving forward, needing to take a look at how we regulate this, how we teach our kids about how to use this tool efficiently and safely.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's certainly in our earlier segment with Dr. Husty from Chalk, we're talking about the best use of tools. In general, are you seeing, outside of even the pandemic, any problems or even just, the good and the bad pertaining to social media and adolescence?
I don't think people are coming to my office telling me about all the good things necessarily that social media is doing for us. But I can tell you that it is developmentally appropriate after a certain age, and that's as people are really entering their adolescence, to align more with their peers. They're really doing a lot of self-discovery. They're trying on a lot of different hats and figuring out how they fit into the world and the world around them. This is part of the natural process of your kids leaving the nest, and certainly a time for experimentation that needs to still have some degree of parental monitoring. When I have been working with youth and with parents, there has been some tension at times, some struggle about access to social media and what are the appropriate guidelines and guidance that parents should be giving to their teens, because this isn't something that we can rely on how we were parented. There was not social media. This didn't exist. So we are really trying to apply other types of parenting strategies and to this new medium that's simply not going anywhere and is probably going to be an increasingly important part of our day-to-day lives.
Is there an argument to be made that when you look at, just adolescence over time, different generations had different kind of mountains to climb, so to speak. So maybe in the early 1900s, the introduction of the car, and then, in the 40s and the 50s, you have the introduction of the telephone being in everyone's home and that being a social tool for adolescents. And, now we have these things, we have social media and cell phones and all of that. Is part of it just one generation not knowing and not being the adopter of the next generation? Is there some, validity to that?
I think so. I think those are really ripe analogies. And what I've seen, unfortunately, is that for a lot of parents who are struggling with how to guide their children, that they have so much anxiety about knowing where to start because that connection is so important to their children. Using a blanket approach of removing social media or removing access to phones can actually be really damaging to your child if that's where they're seeking their validation and their connections to peers, which is, again, developmentally appropriate. So really having a framework for safe use. So I use cars as an analogy for this all the time. And certainly, when you're handing over the keys to the car to your newly licensed driver, you're doing so with an expectation of trust and with, some parameters and this is not just a carte blanche, here's the car, go to town. You have to have expectations and consequences as well. So I think that analogy can be applied over to social media, the use of cell phones in general, as well as other risky things that teens might be experimenting with.
But I love that you say that because I hadn't thought about that, but it's absolutely perfect. I would have never thought of putting my kid behind the wheel of a car without a lot of lessons, a lot of understanding. What are the rules? What are the restrictions? And yet I handed them over a cell phone without thinking twice about it. So when you say like there's framework, that you make that analogy and then there's a framework for it, what does that framework look like?
Of course, it's going to depend on the kid and their family values. I like to guide parents where if there is a struggle about use of the phone, about use of social media, that this is a scaffolded approach. So, if we're talking about the car, if we're talking about, you're not just throwing your kid in the pool, right? You're taking them to swimming lessons. If you're around the ocean, you're wearing your life jacket when it's appropriate. And these are staged appropriately for that kid's developmental level. So each kid might be different depending on their propensity for taking on risk or their, reliability with adhering to rules. There's going to be a different amount of oversight. So I think that having house rules is going to be important, because if we're trying to lead our children by example, if we as parents are constantly glued to our phones, our social media, it's going to be hard to expect our children to regulate themselves when children are notoriously not able to self-regulate for desired activities, and when we're not setting that example. So I like house rules, and for
Right.
some families that could be different than others. There certainly could be exceptions, but for example, no screens at meal times, no screens 30 to 60 minutes before bed. And if your kid is engaging in risky behaviors, then there is going to be a higher level of supervision, and that may depend again on to what degree your child is engaging in risky behaviors. But again, that it's not without consequence, because until kids reach adulthood, their brains are not fully developed. The frontal lobe is the last part of your brain to develop, and that's not really done cooking until you're somewhere between the age of 25 and 30, which is interesting that the actuaries had landed on 25 for being able to rent a car, even though you can drive at 16. So our data actually backs that up as far as risk assessment, mapping onto what we know about brain development. So until your kid has their own frontal lobe, they have to borrow yours, and you're going to function as that executive function for your children.
And I had not thought about that. I mean, we think about you're 18, you're an adult, and an adult you can do whatever you want. And Dr. Husty brought that up, and your dates are actually even a little further than hers, because she talked about 23 to 25. And I just don't think we as parents think about that being, and it's not until then that you kind of get your act together, as far as your frontal lobe is concerned. And there is a lot of information hitting our kids right now, through a screen, well before they hit that age. So I'm really grateful too that you talk about as well that just taking it away is not necessarily the best answer, because with everything we need moderation. Now, with that, is there an age limit? Like you talk about the framework and what's age appropriate. Is there an age limit that you recommend, that you start teaching kids about these rules and what that framework is, or even giving them a phone? Is there a recommended age, or is it strictly case by case?
I would say certainly there's going to be circumstances where, a family needs their child to have an internet accessible device before the normal age that we would think. But really, my kids are little and they have tablets, because, when we have gone on plane trips in the past, or car trips, or when I need to make dinner, it's reasonable that they have some outlet for entertainment that's safe. So having the appropriate safeguards on there. So whether it's restricted access, or apps that monitor, or apps that keep track of how much time is being used, or requiring a parent login, or social media specifically, there's actually a law that was passed in 1998 by Congress, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, says that most social media platforms require someone to be age 13 or older. But our kids are smart enough that they can just enter an earlier birth date. That's probably not keeping anybody out of there. So perhaps this is more similar to other difficult life conversations, where you want to have your kid have a sense of moderation and a sense of self-regulation, and give them a sense of your values, that you're having these conversations before your kid is bringing them up. So like alcohol, like sexual activity, by the time your kid is bringing it up, they probably already been exposed to it in a different medium that you weren't able to participate in the narrative about. So most parents nowadays are probably millennials, some Gen Xers. So these are a group of parents who are, by and large, pretty tech savvy, pretty connected themselves, not to fall into the trap of understanding what adolescents are doing when they're experimenting with this medium that we didn't have in our youth, but that we can set example, again, by having house rules and by engaging our kids in safe disclosure. When I'm walking with my kids down the street, I have conversations with them about, how do we know when to cross the road? I do things like how to assess whether someone is safe to talk to. And are we having those same conversations with our children when they're engaging with people online, that they're not supposed to be sharing photos, identifiable information, their address, or other things that could be putting them at risk? Again, I think we know to have those conversations in real life, but are we having those conversations shaping how kids are interacting? Because the threat assessment might not be there. If you're out on the street and like a stranger in a windowless van drives up to you, that's like the exact scenario we've been preparing our kids for. When you're in the safety of your own home and you're on a device that has only been like fun and enjoyable, yet someone is now inquiring or posing as a child that might be looking to get access to something that they shouldn't have we prepared our children adequately for that? So make sure that they have that guidance before going in.
And I think you bring a really good point that, the safety of your physical environment is so much easier because it's physical. It's right there. It's in your face. And yet when you're talking about your online environment, it's really easy to be lulled into a false sense of security. Now, when you talk about having these conversations, some of these, especially when you're talking about a slightly older adolescent, they're uncomfortable conversations to have. Do you have any guidelines or, just kind of recommended, icebreakers, I guess, of, easing yourself into these conversations with your kids?
My hope is that this is one of the easier conversations you can have with your children. There's lots of hard ones that are going to be on the docket. I think having a factual, non-judgmental approach, it's going to be awkward for your child as well as it is for you. And I was trained, and I firmly believe that as a parent, we have two functions in our child's life: to give them unconditional love and to give them boundaries. So kids feel safe when there are boundaries. They might push against them, they might try to break them, but ultimately there is a sense of security when they know what those boundaries are and that you're going to hold them firm, because that's going to keep them ultimately safe, emotionally as well as physically. So however your preferred icebreaker is, likely that's going to be a one-on-one conversation, or maybe you've got a couple of adolescents and you're going to want to present the information in an age-appropriate way. If a kid is old enough to ask a question, they're old enough to get an age-appropriate answer, and it might need to come with a disclaimer that the information you're going to share with them might make them have certain feelings. If you as a parent are going to make a personal disclosure about one of your experiences, then you want to make sure that that's going to do more benefit for your child than harm. This isn't the time to put your burden onto your child, or to say, give them an out for perhaps, undesired behavior. We don't want to approach them with judgment or the idea that parents have acted perfectly and continue to act perfectly. But we also don't want to make our problems their problems.
Well, and I think just like you mentioned earlier, just taking away the device, cold turkey, which would probably be done in anger, in the moment of something that has happened. I would imagine that the ideal situation is that you're having this conversation away from any emotion like that it's just really, it's just now it's time to talk about this and we just need to be safe.
With anything that is considered a privilege, I like to flip the script of what we're used to doing. And it's very subtle, but I do think the language matters here. So many times we'll hear about kids being upset, they took away my tablet, they took away my phone. In reality, that's a privilege. That's not something that your parents are required to give to you. Certainly some kids may be using it appropriately, using it as a tool. It's a device to monitor safety and be able to stay in communication with your parents. But at the same time, we don't want to conflate that with the idea that this isn't something that the child needs to demonstrate appropriate behavior in order to earn. So instead of the narrative that parents are taking away, which implies that it's something that you were owed, the item wasn't earned. And so I would recommend, as you are giving your child this device, that you do set that expectation that this can be earned by wanted behavior. Some people like to confuse this with a bribe. That's not the same. The bribe is if you're going to the supermarket and you give your kid the lollipop on the way in and say, I'm going to give you this, but you've got to act this way. The earned behavior, the reward, which is much more behaviorally reinforcing, is if you tell them that if they got to give clear, explicit direction, that if they are kind, if they are quiet, if they don't grab anything off the shelves, then at the end of the shopping trip, they can earn a lollipop. so that if they don't end up having that, then you can explain to them that it was their behavior, that they are actually in charge of the reason they did or did not earn this. So similarly with the phone, and again, just like a car, maybe this would be if your kid has a job and they need to drive drive to work, if they have to go do, drop off their siblings, drive themselves to school, you're not going to remove the car completely because you can't hold up that punishment. That's not going to work. But if you find that your kid is constantly running out of gas, or if they're getting speeding tickets, or if they're engaging in other risky behavior, they might only be able to use the car for a certain radius or for certain purposes, with the expectation that they can earn some of those privileges back.
Right. Just coming down to a simple matter of trust.
Exactly.
And building that trust. So I really like that. One of the last questions I have for you is, again, harkening back to what I talked about with Dr. Husty, is she mentioned, I actually had asked the question about how much do we know about social media addiction and adolescence. And in our conversation, she was talking about that at the end of the day, the most important thing is healthy balance. That, we may not have a lot of stats right now about addiction and what that does to children, but it's very easy to tell when a life is out of balance. And that's true for a teenager, it's true for a preteen, it's true for an adult. And if there's not balance, that's what we need to bring back into their life. Would you agree with that?
I think what's very clear is that this isn't going anywhere. So we need to figure out how to integrate this into our lives in a way that does allow for balance, that does allow for primarily safe use, enriching use. And the thing that concerns me is when I see people completely disengaging from their actual life in order to live this kind of virtual life. And that's not exclusive to social media, of course, but I think social media can be a prime example. I mean, we've probably all been at restaurants and see people taking a picture of their food, and I feel like the lack of sort of presence in your true five senses is perhaps problematic. And obviously, social media is a very curated environment. So if you are conflating your sort of mundane existence to somebody's very cultivated, gallery that they're exposing, then that's going to be, it's going to rob you of your joy. I'm a firm believer in mindfulness as a practice, and that is, attending to your presence in your moment that you're in. John Kabat-Zinn has written a lot about this, and there's some excellent therapeutic methods. But I think sometimes it can be more challenging to be present in your day-to-day life if you are having emotional challenges or feel like the need to escape. So we don't want to use social media as a agent to remove ourselves from our lives, because then we're not able to sort of move forward and enjoy the things that are worth enjoying.
Thank you. All great advice. Dr. Chiarelli, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to talk with you and to hear more about this. I think you gave some really good, solid advice and some great tips to those who are watching.
Thank you again for having me.
And for our audience, thank you for joining us for this last and final episode of our special series on social media. Again, today's topic was social media and mental health. If you have a need for any specialized care or actions, we will put some resources on our website along with this post. But thank you as always for joining us for this discussion. And we want to thank our sponsors, UCI and UCI Health, for underwriting our programs in the Future Of series, as well as this particular program. And please visit our website and our social media streams, which sounds funny to say, but we will be posting more about upcoming and future shows, as well as those that we're presenting again. So thank you for joining us. And as always, thank you for being a part of the discussion.